Right, I see folks are joining, so in the interest of time, I'm going to go right ahead and get started with today's event. So, hello everyone, and welcome to today's important briefing on the increased attacks on Muslims after Pahalgam. For those unfamiliar with what happened in Pahalgam, let me give you some context. On April 22nd, a terrorist attack occurred in Jammu and Kashmir's Pahalgam, which killed at least 26 tourists and injured over 20 others, marking the region's deadliest terror attack since 2019. 25 of those murdered were Hindu. Instead of honestly confronting this lapse in intelligence and utter failure to ensure peace and security in Kashmir, the far-right Indian government, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party, began fanning the flames of anti-Muslim hatred to justify a military escalation with Pakistan. While the two nations were trading airstrikes, killing civilians on both sides of the border, BJP leaders and their supporters called for vengeance against all Muslims, Pakistani, Indian, Kashmiri, Bangladeshi, Rohingya. As a result, 184 anti-Muslim hate crimes, including murders, were reported in the aftermath of the attack, as documented in a report by the Association for the Protection of Civil Rights, an India-based organization. You can see the data here on the screen. The map shows that Uttar Pradesh state in North India bore witness to the highest number of incidents, but incidents were reported all over the country: Bihar, Maharashtra, Delhi, Telangana, Karnataka, Punjab, etc. Now, weeks later, India and Pakistan have de-escalated, but violence and hate speech against Muslims in India remains rampant, driven by politicians and their Hindu militant supporters alike. You all know this story. It's something that history has told us 1,000 times before. An act of violence and tragedy is weaponized by bad actors, used to justify more violence and hatred against the most vulnerable. This is what we're seeing in India, and we've been seeing it for weeks now. And to illustrate the extent of this anti-Muslim violence, we prepared the following video, which I will be playing for you now. Just let me know if the sound doesn't work, because that seems to be a recurring problem with me.
26 का बदला अगर 2600 से ना लिया तो मैं भारत माता का पुत्र नहीं।
कश्मीरी मुसलमानों, कल 10 बजे तक का टाइम है, यहाँ से भाग जाओ।
हमारे साथ बहुत ज़्यादा टॉर्चर किया जा रहा है, हमें बहुत ज़्यादा डराया जा रहा है।
India and Pakistan saw a 4-day aerial conflict after terrorists brazenly killed Indians holidaying in Kashmir in April. Sadly, the tragedy was used by Hindu extremists in the country to target innocent Muslims and their properties across the country. Since the April 22nd killings of tourists in Kashmir's Pahalgam, a brutal backlash has gripped the country. In city after city, the pattern is chilling. Hate speeches in broad daylight, homes ransacked, mosques vandalized, and Muslims beaten, even killed. In just over 2 weeks, civil rights lawyers counted 184 targeted incidents, 316 victims, from Uttar Pradesh to Maharashtra, from Delhi to Uttarakhand. The data comes from the Association for Protection of Civil Rights, a respected legal aid network with hundreds of researchers and attorneys across India. Many victims were ordinary people: shopkeepers, farmers, children walking home from school. Sadly, but unsurprisingly, the Indian government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been silent. Few arrests have been reported. Worse, there has been no national outrage. Now, human rights experts are calling for international scrutiny, saying India must be held accountable under global law. The mob vengeance against India's Muslims is tearing the world's largest democracy apart. This violence and targeting must stop.
If this video was hard for you to watch, if the violence made you flinch or the stories of terror made you uneasy, then you've got just a little glimpse of what it feels like to be Muslim within India's borders right now. Now, how do we make sense of this issue? What else is happening on the ground, and what should our response be? To answer those questions and give us more insights, I'm turning it over now to our panel of esteemed experts who are joining us from all over the world right now. And I'm very, very honored to announce our first panelist and welcome him to speak, Professor Nicolas Levroy, who was appointed as the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues in October of 2023. He has spent decades researching minority rights, federalism, and legal systems. He served as the professor of international and European law at the University of Geneva since 2001. He also launched Human Rights Week, which has been in place since 2012. In 2022, he was elected the second vice president of the Advisory Committee on the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities of the Council of Europe, a position which he resigned from when taking up his role as Special Rapporteur. And he has over 150 publications and extensive expertise and experience advising governments and international organizations to his name. Professor Leroy, it is such an honor to have you here. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. And it is my pleasure to share my thought on this very worrying situation that Muslims in India are confronted with. As you may know, unfortunately, there is no or very few international norms to protect minorities as binding treaty obligation. India is party to a series of treaties protecting human rights, and within that framework, there are general rules that can be invoked to ask for the respect of the religious freedom within India, meaning that people belonging to a specific religion may not be targeted because of their belonging to this group. The idea of minority protection is precisely to, beyond the individual human rights that belong to every single person, also that the fact that a person belongs to a minority, to a group which has different characteristics as regard religion, could be also as regard language, could be as regard ethnic background, this should not be a cause for discrimination. Actually, if you look at the architecture of human rights, one of the most fundamental principles is the principle of non-discrimination. It's Article 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's Article 2 also of the 1966 International Covenant. So non-discrimination is fundamental, and even more for minorities. Actually, very interestingly, in 1948, when the Universal Declaration is adopted, which is considered as the, let's say, basement of the whole human rights architecture, there is this Article 2, which prohibits discrimination based on different factors, including religion. So that should cover us. But there is also a declaration in the same General Assembly resolution about minorities, which is separated from this general principle of non-discrimination. Somehow, persons belonging to minorities should have additional protection than just the general non-discrimination. So in contemporary international law, there is one major provision, which is in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 27, which says that in countries in which minorities exist, then they cannot be denied the right to exert their specific characteristic as a minority, be it religion, be it language, be it other defining characteristic. And even more interestingly, in this International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 18 guarantees the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. It's usually the first paragraph that most people refer to, which guarantees individual freedom of choice. But I think the second and third paragraph of this convention, which has been ratified by India, so India is bound by these legal texts, says very clearly, I quote, "No one shall be subject to coercion which would impair his freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his choice." So it's not only the persons who can freely choose, but there is a duty for the state to make sure that there is no coercion against the exercise of this freedom of religion. So here there is a concrete duty which bears upon India as a signatory state, a party to this convention, to make sure that no coercion happens. And the third paragraph says that actually a state may impose some limitation on the exercise of the freedom of religion, but they have a very limited scope. It can only be such limitation as are prescribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, order, health, or moral, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. So it seems obvious in this specific situation that India is not living up to its international commitments. What I find interesting and specific is that actually minority rights were developed before international human rights, after First World War in Europe, around the issue of national minorities. And national minorities were persons which consider themselves belonging to a nation, but living in the next nation, because the border had been drawn and they were a minority in a country from which they did not share the characteristic, the national characteristic. I feel that in South India, it's not so much the national issue, but this religious issue, especially between Pakistan and India, and we can see that what happened is linked to this tension between these two countries, which is kind of a parallel situation of what we know in Europe about national minority. And this is naturally extremely worrying because the individual human rights shall not be dependent on political relation between two neighboring states. So yes, there is a responsibility of India for not protecting, not allowing Muslims to freely exert their religion in India and not to be targeted because they are Muslim, because they belong to a religious minority in everyday life. On this responsibility, I think it has to be clear that the international responsibility is subsidiary to the national implementation of human rights. Basically, individuals have very little way to reach the international level. And again, it is really a subsidiary protection. The main protection should come from the national legal system, which should implement these principles, which are to be found in international treaties to which India, as many other countries, is committed. And there, it is also extremely important, and we find that in the same International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that actually there is no discrimination before the law, that the law shall be taking care of different situations, but shall not discriminate within its own text between persons belonging to different religions. And naturally, the law should protect the individual. So the state of India, the authorities, have to be held accountable, but first and foremost in front of national jurisdiction, where victims or family of victims can bring their claim, and if the system functions correctly, and this is a problem now because in many countries, even if in some that were considered as leading country as regard with respect of the rule of law, we can see that there is an erosion of this functioning of justice to guarantee proper respect of human rights within the national system. At international level, sure, there are mechanisms within the UN. There is the Human Rights Council, which can look at the situation in some state, either through universal periodical review, through treaty bodies. There is a way to reach to treaty bodies which regularly monitor the respect of human rights, and naturally myself and others in the special procedure of the Human Rights Council, we can also try to monitor and to call for responsibility from member states. But again, I would say this is subsidiary. This is something that we are willing to do, we are here to do, but it's not as important as the possibility for individuals or communities to ask for respect of their right in front of national jurisdiction. And it seems, from what I know and from what I can read, that this is a serious problem as regards the full enjoyment of their rights by Muslims in India. And naturally, the state can say, oh, but it was not state action against individual, it was other individuals, but the state has a duty to protect its citizens. The state has a duty to allow everyone to live in safety. And again, very obviously, the state is not properly protecting Muslims in India. And as far as we can see, there are incendiary narratives being brought up by the authorities, even at the highest level, and this is very problematic. So I don't want to take more time right now in this introductory remark, but again, we are following from Geneva, where I'm based actually, and where the Human Rights Council is based. So there is attention brought to this situation, but again, this is a slow process and not a very efficient one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Levois, for those in-depth remarks on what tools are available to the United Nations, what pressures can be put on the state of India. Thank you again for taking the time to join us from Geneva. I'm now going to turn it over to someone who has been for decades at the forefront of India's most consequential legal battles, Mr. Prashant Bhushan, a senior advocate for the Supreme Court of India, from exposing corruption at the highest levels to fighting for environmental justice to defending the independence of the judiciary. Mr. Bhushan has been at the forefront of it all. He was a lead petitioner in the landmark 2G spectrum case and has consistently taken on governments, corporations, and institutions of power with fearlessness. He's been referred to by the Times of India as a legal luminary for his frequent use of public interest litigations to bring significant issues to the forefront of public discourse and push for reform. In 2024, Mr. Bhushan secured a resounding win in his campaign against corruption when India's Supreme Court ruled that the controversial electoral bonds scheme by which corporations could anonymously donate millions of dollars to political parties as unlawful and struck it down. Huge victory there. So we are very honored to have Mr. Bhushan joining us today. Sir, please go ahead.
Thank you, Safa, and thank you to IAMC for organizing this. In order to understand, in order to understand what the Indian government, the BJP, and its supporters in India are doing with Muslims in the wake of the terrorist attack in Pahalgam, we need to understand the whole politics of the BJP and Mr. Modi and the BJP's IT cell, etc. Their politics in India today depends almost entirely on fomenting hatred against Muslims and against Christians, against minorities, polarizing the country between Hindus and minorities, and thereby winning the elections in their domestic politics by this polarization, by this religious polarization. And in fact, the politics around Pakistan is also devoted to, essentially connected to the domestic politics of the BJP, which is how to use what happens in Pakistan or the whole Pakistan narrative as a means to garner domestic political support in India to win elections. So if you see what happened, that immediately after this Pahalgam terrorist attack, there was no attempt made by the no serious attempt, I should say, made by the Indian government to find out who the real terrorists were, to catch them, etc. There was no attempt to explain the security failure or the intelligence failure which led to the attacks. But immediately the focus was shifted to bashing Pakistan and bashing Indian Muslims. So immediately after these attacks, Mr. Modi, instead of going to Pahalgam, he straight went to Bihar, where the next domestic election is going to be held in India, and used the attack in his political rallies to garner support for the government. If you see what their ministers have been doing, in fact, one of their ministers from Madhya Pradesh, BJP minister, attacked the Muslim Air Force officer who was the spokesperson of the Indian government and the Indian military, explaining what the Indian military was doing on the when they did this Operation Sindoor. That minister said that she is the sister of these terrorists merely because she was a Muslim. So this is just an example of how the BJP has been using the Hindu-Muslim issue in India as well as the India-Pakistan issue for their domestic politics to try and polarize uh, public opinion in India on Hindu-Muslim lines. So, as you pointed out, Safa, the APCR report shows that in the wake of this Pahalgam incident, there have been a very large number of hate crimes against Muslims in India. They have documented 184 instances, and if you see, almost all the instances of hate crimes in India are in BJP ruled states. 43 in UP, 24 in Maharashtra, 24 in Uttarakhand, 20 in Madhya Pradesh, all BJP ruled. And those in the opposition ruled states are very, very few and far between. Not even 10% of the total hate crimes are in non BJP ruled states. So, um, so the BJP's whole playbook has been to use Pakistan. So for example, immediately after this terrorist attack, without showing any evidence that the terrorists had come from Pakistan or had been sponsored by Pakistan, the whole country, including and particularly the BJP IT cell, the media, which is called the lapdog media in India, which is controlled by the government, they went on a complete spree of bashing Pakistan and also started bashing Indian Muslims. And this has been their playbook all along. And as I said, their whole Pakistan obsession and this bashing Pakistan, which takes place periodically and repeatedly, is also for domestic politics, is also for trying to drum up this kind of nationalism, muscular nationalism in India against Pakistan in order to bash Muslims in India because Pakistan is seen as a Muslim state. Uh, this has been their entire politics. This is what they did immediately after the Pulwama incident, which about which again no real evidence has come to suggest that the attackers had come from Pakistan or there was Pakistan's involvement in it. But of course, immediately after any terrorist incident happens, the government and the media that they control go on an overdrive to say that this is Pakistan, and then they use Pakistan as an excuse for drumming up nationalism as well as bashing Indian Muslims. So this has been their response consistently. Now, unfortunately, the UN Rapporteur for Human Rights said that the role needs to be played by domestic institutions, particularly the judiciary, to stop this kind of bashing. which is completely unconstitutional, which is completely illegal. I mean, forget international treaties. I mean, it violates various fundamental rights. It violates Article 21, Article 14, Article 19, everything, all the fundamental rights under the Indian Constitution, this kind of hate crimes which are going on. But unfortunately, though the judiciary has been charged with the responsibility to maintain the rule of law, to protect the rights of the minorities, etc., but unfortunately, we don't see the judiciary intervening even in the wake of such kind of hate crimes, and they often go along with the government's narrative in at least such situations as happened after the Pahalgam attack. They often go along with the government narrative. For example, immediately after this, they used this incident to try and throw out Rohingya refugees out of India, or people who they feel are non-Indian citizens or uh, 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 Bangladeshi citizens who have challenged uh, that thing in court, and yet, in violation of all international norms as well as violation of our domestic laws, the government used this to throw them out. And unfortunately, when this matter was brought up before the Indian Supreme Court did not interfere with this, and they often go along with the government's narrative. So it is unfortunate that this is happening, but this is the domestic politics of the BJP, and I feel that the only effective way to counter this is for us to build public opinion and for us to build a counter narrative about all this and point out how this is weakening the country. If you divide the country on religious lines, when you have 15% Muslim population in this country, it is definitely going to weaken the country. And therefore, we need to point out the positive contribution of Indian Muslims in the country and stop this kind of hate narrative that the BJP and its IT cell and its cohorts have been spinning in the media. So that's what we need to do, and that ultimately that public opinion also influences the judiciary in how they react to these kind of hate crimes and the open spreading of hate against Muslims that we are seeing in India. So I'll stop here. Thank you, Safa, for having me.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pushan, for those insightful remarks. It's always an honor to hear from you. I will now turn it over to our next panelist, who is Suchitra Vijayan, who is the executive director of the Polis Project, a New York-based digital magazine and a hybrid research and journalism organization that documents communities in resistance at the intersection of politics, art, and culture. She is also the chair of the International Human Rights Committee of the New York City Bar Association and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Midnight's Borders, A People's History of Modern India, as well as How Long Can the Moon Be Caged? Voices of Indian Political Prisoners, two incredible reads that I recommend to everyone. Suchitra, it's an honor to have you here as always. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Safa. Thank you, IMC. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible and important work that Professor Leverett, Mr. Bhushan, and others in this panel have been doing consistently for decades, which enables the work of many of us. And again, it's an absolute it's not a good time to be gathering, but it's also, I think, important for us to acknowledge this moment and kind of take it from there. What I'm going to do is really break my my brief remarks into three parts. One, I want to start with the report that was produced itself and kind of look at what has been happening. And we think through issues in terms of what it means for us to understand violence against minorities, especially Muslims, Dalits, Bahujans, and Adivasis in India, not as a spectacle, not as isolated events, but an actual blueprint that is being perfected over and over again. And if you look at the violence post Pahalgam attack that everybody's spoken about, one of the things that we see is that how quickly one instance was used to mobilize and create and subsequently create 184 different incidents across 19 Indian states, over a period of just 6 days. And I think that is something that we have to understand. And that just does not happen immediately. It's a system that is coordinated, it is state tolerated, and it is state enabled. And I think these are the three things that we really have to keep repeating over and over again. This is systematic, this is state backed. Something that we all have to understand is that a state as powerful as the Indian state, if there is any form of violence, especially in the nature of this, it is happening because the state hasn't stepped in to put an end to it. Again, another thing that we really have to understand as a part of the coordinated and the state-tolerated Muslim, anti-Muslim pogroms is that the sheer breadth and the spread of the violence, it's a pattern, right? Again, I'm repeating this, is that it is not spontaneous, it's mobilized for vengeance, it's fueled by hate speech, it's fueled by political sanction and police inaction. And some of the things that we have to really understand about this violence is very similar to what happened after the revocation of Article 370 in 2019, where again, Kashmiri students and Muslim students across the country ended up becoming targets of violence soon after the revocation of Article 370. And you see these kinds of individual instances often becoming the trigger for multiple instances across the country. Now, based on the report that was shared, what you're really seeing is, of course, is the geographical spread. And as Mr. Bhushan rightly pointed out, this happens across the country, but the severity and the quickness often happens in BJP-ruled or held states. Second, who are the actors? The actors are often Hindutva outfits that are closely related to the BJP, which is the Bajrang Dal, the BHP, the Hindu Raksha Dal, and Rudra Sena. And these are consistently identified as perpetrators over and over again. Often these groups work with police complacency or with direct complicity. And I think the complacency is now, I would say, almost always replaced by direct complicity. Now, what kinds and forms of violence are we talking about? We're talking about physical assault, vandalism, eviction, arson, denial of services, economic boycotts, death threats. Just as we're talking about Pahalgam and what's happening here, I think it's also important for us to kind of very quickly go back and look at what's happening in Uttarakhand. Uttarakhand is another place where we are seeing more of these blueprints that are being used, which very specifically targets the Muslim community, where in multiple instances, local activists have even called for patterns or blueprints of ethnic cleansing, where you're seeing the same patterns in which you see economic boycotts, death threats, using very localized incidents to very quickly spread violence and hatred quite extensively. So when we talk about attacks against Muslims in India, it is never an isolated event. It's often something that is coordinated quite extensively through their networks. Now, institutional violence is now again transforming in India. We saw multiple instances of unlawful demolitions of homes in Kashmir, denial of medical care, suspension of Muslim workers and students. And of course, finally, all of this is tied together with a very particular kind of speech. We are looking at elected officials, religious leaders openly calling for arming of Hindus, expelling, targeting Muslims, and often this very proud rhetorical demand to replicate what Israel is doing in Palestine to be replicated not only in Kashmir, but against Indian Muslims. Use of slogans like all eyes on Pahalgam becomes a rallying cry, not to mourn the victims of these attacks, but to really become a rallying cry for communal violence. So again, what we have to talk about repeatedly over and over again, this not as a backlash, but as an actual blueprint. What we are seeing are laboratories of violence perfected and created in various places across the country, which are being replicated. Now, for us to very quickly go back to Pahalgam itself, one of the things we have to understand is that it's been over a month. And I think at this point in time, if my numbers are correct, we've had over 2,000 houses in Kashmir demolished as a part of the illegal demolition drive. But we still do not know anything about the 3 men the Indian state claim are the armed gunmen, right? So who are these 3 men? Initially, the mention was of 3 attackers. The names were released by Indian media, but various media then went on to say it was 3, it was 4, it was 5. A month in, we still do not know who these men were and how many of them were there and who was attacked. We also do not know where they are. They have not been, there's been no information since. While the official list of suspects keeps changing, the number of homes that we've already demolished, as I said, has expanded. What we really are seeing is that more than 2,000 Kashmiris, including children as young as 13, have been detained without formal charges. Families have been forcefully evicted from their homes, subjected to beatings, punished for acts that they've neither proven or committed. We have arbitrary detention. We have what we're seeing really is the replication of collective punishment. Another aspect that we have to normalize and increasingly use is the idea that when something happens in one part of the country, and the fact that entire Muslim communities across the subcontinent get vilified and targeted specifically in India, then it is an act of collective punishment. It is no longer just it's no longer just an isolated event. So again, we have to use the language of systematic, but also systematic replication of violence, building infrastructures that allow for impunity to flourish. Along with it, what you're really seeing is the outcome of collective punishment. Again, I think one of the things that we have to speak about is media's role in normalizing these kinds of violence, whether it is the wave of demolitions, mass detentions. Often the mainstream reporting routinely names all Muslim individuals as terrorists. Often they're held without trial, evidence, or any kind of independent verification. These are also acts of collective punishment framed as counter-terrorism. Another thing that we've seen quite extensively deployed in India for a pretty long time. It's not new, but the severity, the violence, the cycle, the replications keep getting, they keep becoming, the cycles become shorter, the violence becomes more grotesque, and that is what we're seeing repeating over and over again. The media narratives also strip the victims of visibility, agency, humanity, reducing them to a threat that can then, when the law takes over, and kind of builds this narrative of who they are. What I'm going to do is that it's also important for us to understand that since we are talking about Pahalgam, again, we have to think about the idea that these kinds of demolitions of Kashmiri homes are not new. We have seen both military demolition operations and punitive demolitions. And one of the things that we've done in Polis Project is really do a timeline of destruction of Kashmiri property going back to 1989, which again, what really brings us back to is the way in which the Indian states targets these communities. Again, I know I keep repeating this, is that we really have to think about this not as a spectacle, not as isolated events. Often India is called the world's largest democracy, which also gives it a very particular kind of cover when we talk about violence against minorities as an exception and not the normal. And I think those are languages that we have to very specifically think about. This is systematic. This is ongoing. This is, as of now, unending. There are regimes of impunity that is built in and infrastructures that allow for this vilification to happen. But really what we are going and looking at right now is the idea of collective punishment. I'll kind of stop there. Thank you.
Chitra, thank you so much for the use of so many incredible examples, as well as phrases such as laboratories of violence being perfected across the country. I think that really illustrates the depth and the severity of what we're seeing here. So thank you again. I will now turn it to our final panelist, Professor Apurvanand, who is a prominent Indian academic and human rights advocate. His critical essays have appeared in all major Hindi journals. Apart from his academic and literary writings, he also contributes columns in Indian newspapers and magazines on the issues of education, culture, communalism, violence, and human rights. His sharp critique of the Indian government is highly influential. I presume it is scary to those he is criticizing, to the point where he was recently, in effect, denied permission to travel for a speaking engagement in the United States by his university, which gives you some sense of the power of the professor's words. So we're very pleased to have you here. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Safa. Thank you for having me. Thank you, IMC. I think there is very little to add to what Prashant Bhushanji and Suchitra have already said, and I agree with Suchitra that whatever has been happening after the Pahalgam attack should not be seen in isolation. They are in fact part of the blueprint that was laid out long back by one of the founders of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and its Sar-Sanchalak Guru Golwalkar and Savarkar. And the objective of the campaign, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the parent body of Bharatiya Janata Party, which is heading the union government of India and which heads many state governments in India. And the objective is to turn India into Hindu Rashtra, where Muslims would be allowed to live, but allowed to live in a very restrictive manner. Their lives would be restrained, and they would live as second-class citizen or second-class people. So that is the objective, and that objective is slowly and gradually being achieved. And last 11 years have been very crucial to achieve this objective. And each incident, like the incident of Pahalgam, is used to bring closer to fruition the real objective, which is to turn India into a Hindu Rashtra and turn Muslims and Christians into second-class citizens. We have discussed and talked about the data and statistics of the incidents of violence. But what is also very important to understand is that Muslims are now being asked not to speak. So they are being silenced. One is physical act of violence, where you demolish houses and business establishments, you jail people, but you also tell in many ways Muslims that they are not allowed to speak. And most stark example of that is the arrest of Ali Khan Mahmoodabad, which we must talk about because it's post Pahalgam thing, and it's directly related to what happened in Pahalgam and about the Indian response or the response of the Indian state to the Pahalgam terrorist attack. The Indian state, after a hiatus of 15 days or so, launched what it named Operation Sindoor and targeted 9 spots inside Pakistan. And it resulted again in a conflict situation which lasted for 3 days and which resulted in killing of civilians on both sides of the border. And Professor Ali Khan Mahmoodabad was deliberating on this situation, and he wrote 2 Facebook posts because we had seen in those 3 days Indian television channels and Indian media doing war mongering on a humongous scale. So what Professor Ali Khan Mahmoodabad, who is an associate professor of political science at Ashoka University, a private university located very close to the national capital, Delhi. It's located in Haryana, Sonipat. And he wrote against warmongering, and he said that all calls for war should be opposed. Any sane person would oppose it. And he talked about the optics of Sophia Khan, an army officer who was fielded by the Indian government with another woman army officer, Vyomika Singh, to represent India's or to present India's case to the world. And it was presented as a symbol of the plural character of India or the secular character of India, and to show to the world that we're much better than Pakistan, which is an Islamic country where minorities don't have any right. Here we have a Muslim representing India, and representing India in its most critical moment. And we are allowing a Muslim voice. So Sophia Qureshi, the army officer, was presented as Muslim voice, who was exercising her agency to, to defend India's position. But we know that this was not the case because she was merely a spokesperson and she was reading the script that was given to her by the Indian government. And, uh, and Ali Khan Mahmoodabad talked about this optics, and he said that it should be matched uh, by action against mob lynchings in India, and in providing justice to those Muslims who have been wronged by the mob or by state agencies whose houses have been demolished. So this is what Ali Khan Mahmoodabad said, and he was immediately attacked by the Women's Commission of Haryana, uh, which was a very bizarre thing. Haryana Women's Commission alleged that Ali Khan Mahmoodabad had insulted Sophia Khan and Vyomika Singh, which again was a very bizarre allegation that she made because Ali Khan Mahmoodabad had not said a word against Sophia Khan or Vyomika Singh, but she said that since she felt insulted by his words and she felt hurt, he must have committed some crime. So the onus was on Ali Khan Mahmoodabad to prove that there was nothing offensive in his remarks. And when he represented himself before the commission through his lawyers and defended, and when a public petition was launched in solidarity with Ali Khan Mahmoodabad, what we saw unfolding was a very dangerous drama. An FIR was lodged against Ali Khan Mahmoodabad, was a functionary of the Bharatiya Janata Party, who is a local official in the village adjacent to Ashoka University. And the police converted that complaint into a criminal report, FIR. And Ali Khan Mahmoodabad was charged with crimes like creating enmity between religious groups, hurting the sentiments of a religious group, and charges of sedition. This FIR was lodged at 8 in the evening. And next morning at 7, the police reached his home in Delhi, which is a different state, and he was arrested. And he was remanded to police custody. And it took a 3-day-long battle, judicial battle, and the Supreme Court ultimately gave him an interim relief. He was released on interim bail. But the reasoning of the Supreme Court was very strange. Supreme Court said that Ali Khan Mahmoodabad was indulging in dog whistling. It said that Ali Khan Mahmoodabad should not have used the occasion to gain cheap popularity. And the Supreme Court said that what Ali Khan Mahmoodabad said needs to be analyzed, and it appointed a 3-member special investigative team to investigate the Facebook post, 1,500 word long Facebook post. The Supreme Court itself didn't deem it necessary to read that post. It appointed a 3-member SIT to investigate that. Now, we need to understand the gravity of this thing, because now you have a team of senior police officers examining 2 posts written by Ali Khan Mahmoodabad. And the sword is hanging on Ali Khan Mahmoodabad. And he has been debarred from speaking anything related to this issue. Now, it leads to a chilling effect, affecting especially Muslim scholars and Muslim young men and women. And again, as Suchitra said, that we need to see it in perspective, in the context. For example, and what Supreme Court implied? Supreme Court implied that we cannot take what Ali Khan Mahmoodabad wrote on its face value. There was something which he was not saying by not saying. So it needs to be heard what he was not saying. the same logic was applied to the speech of Omar Khalid. That what Omar Khalid didn't say, he actually wanted to say. So this is what the court says, that you understand, since Omar Khalid is Omar Khalid, he is, and the same logic was present by the Supreme Court in the case of Ali Khan Mahmudabad, that he is an intelligent person, he has a way with words, so he can employ words in a very clever manner, and to mean something very devious and very dangerous. And therefore, Muslims speaking Muslims or thinking Muslims become a very dangerous thing in the present day India. The case of Ali Khan Mahmudabad and should be treated in the seriousness it demands. And we need to understand that post Pahalgam, and we have seen a 19-year-old or 20-year-old girl being arrested for a Facebook post in which she had opposed or she had criticized Operation Sindoor. Now, you are not allowed to criticize Operation Sindoor, especially Muslims are not allowed to criticize Operation Sindoor. So this I wanted to bring to your notice, that apart from the physical acts of violence, what is also happening is to tell Muslims that they don't have a right to speak, they don't have a right to have their opinion, and they don't have a right to express their opinion. And this we see happening in universities and elsewhere as well. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Apurva, and for that incredible deep dive into the way the chilling effect has been taking place, especially with regards to Muslims across India. Again, thank you so much for your time. I'm now going to transition into our Q&A session. Q&A box is open. We do have limited time, so unfortunately we won't be able to take too many, but I will first pose a question to Professor Levois. Because you mentioned mechanisms available to the UN to push states to change. In fact, there has been a lot of outcry from the United Nations recently against India for its treatment of Rohingya refugees, for pushing them into the sea. Tom Andrews, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, just recently called India's actions humane, cruel, and outrageous. And I'm curious to know, with this kind of pressure on India, has India been responsive at all?
No. I'm sorry, I can make a very short answer. Unfortunately, there are less and less countries that are responsive and feel accountable as regards human rights bodies. There are bad examples everywhere. And no, India is a very difficult country to work with. Being based in Geneva, I have the opportunity to engage with permanent mission and try to discuss. So I have had contact with Indian ambassador here in Geneva, but it's very difficult to go anywhere except that, okay, they do their job as diplomats, but no, it's not working. I'm sorry to say so.
That is unfortunate. Thank you for your answer. Very succinct answer. I will open this question to our other three esteemed panelists. So all three of you have spoken about not looking at Pahalgam or the response to Pahalgam in isolation, that it is only the latest iteration of a systemic, state-sponsored and state-tolerated pattern of violence, to use Suchitra's powerful wording. But let's look forward a bit. Has the response to Pahalgam charted new grounds for oppression, in your opinion? And what do you think the repercussions will be going forward? I open that up to the other three.
Suchitra, why don't you respond?
Sure. The way that I think about this is that every act, and I think this is something Professor Purvanand spoke about too, is that every act then becomes a trigger to some other form of repression. And I think in the last decade, and then I think when we think about this, we kind of map it going back just before Modi comes to power with the arrest of J.N. Sai Baba and others, to where we are. It's an entire arc through which there is a very particular systematic blueprint of repression that has been reproduced. And I really do see the next coming of years as being incredibly important, because it's also hard, because I think now, unlike the United States, where things are happening and there is still the normalization of repression has not happened, I think in India we have already normalized repression to such a far great extent, as backed by the Indian judiciary, that there is no place for relief. The place for relief is increasingly just shrinking. And I think that is something that is going to be difficult. A decade ago, many of us said the Supreme Court of India will not save you. The Supreme Court of India has not saved its people. But I think what concerns me, or rather what I think we have to actively do in places where institutions are failing, is to go back to understanding what does it mean for us to now rebuild civil society on the ground in India, which still happens to be one of the most effective ways to push back. But for me, I do see both the repression deepening, but also the infrastructure. I mean, we've talked about this quite extensively, is that the regime has built a very robust infrastructures of impunity, and they don't bend for anything. Global opinion no longer seems to matter. So I think that is this moment where I would say we find ourselves in. But I'm sure both Mr. Bhushan and Professor Anand, who are on the ground, would have perhaps have a lot more insights on what's been happening immediately post Pahalgam.
So every incident, I think Suchitra is right. See, every incident like Pahalgam, which happens, every terrorist incident where there are ostensibly Muslim terrorists, it kind of feeds into the general narrative of the BJP and the ruling dispensation and its lapdog media, which is that, look, Muslims are terrorists, Muslims need to be demonized, there needs to be hate against Muslims, etc. And it hardens, or rather further normalizes, this kind of hate that we see. And a terrorist incident like this, where you can blame Pakistan, where you can also say that they were Muslims, the terrorists were Muslims, where you can also say that they asked for the religion before they killed. This is a perfect setup, a perfect setting for the BJP's and the Indian government's playbook to come into play, which, as I said, they use for further hardening the normalization of hate against Muslims in the country, and that is what they have sought to do. And to some extent, they have succeeded, though this Operation Sindoor didn't quite work in the way that they wanted to, and it's not very clear whether they will be able to reap any political dividends from this in the coming elections. But certainly, it helps in hardening the normalization of hate against Muslims.
Very well put, Professor Apoorvand. If you would like to add anything, please do.
For me, what is a matter of concern is the Hindutvification of all organs of the state of India, which include police, bureaucracy, and now even the army.
And the judiciary.
Judiciary, it goes without saying, because you had already pointed it out, and we see how judiciary is turning into a kind of justifier of what BJP has been doing. But more dangerous is the Hindutvification of bureaucracy, police, and army, because we saw the chief of the army going to a Hindu saint, seeking diksha from him, and then that Hindu seer demanded Pakistan occupied Kashmir as Guru Dakshina from him. And so this is a very dangerous site when you see the chief of Indian Army going to a man who is known as a Hindu saint, but who is in fact infamous for his hate speeches against Muslims and Dalits. This politicization of Indian Army is a matter of deep concern, because in all conflict situations, Indian minorities always depended on Indian Army. Now that is slowly going, and that should worry us. So far as the bureaucracy and police are concerned, now it seems that they have decided to align themselves ideologically with BJP. And that again is a very worrying trend, which we see getting more prominent after Pahalgam and Operation Sindoor. Since I teach at university, it also worries me to see that university spaces are being used to generate warmongering, and in a very clever manner, hate speeches are done, or rhetoric is promoted, and nationalist rhetoric is promoted, which ultimately leads to anti-minority, I would say, mindset. So that these things also need to be considered or taken into consideration.
Thank you so much. Suchitra, back over to you.
I just wanted to quickly raise this point because we've not had the opportunity to. I think one of the things we have to speak about is that India's national security state is now also something, it's also a key actor in all of this. Today, we have built a ginormous national security state with funds going to various intelligence agencies. If I'm not mistaken, it was Mr. Bhushan who appeared for that PIL, that I think it was 2016, which sought greater scrutiny of funds of these intelligence agencies, including the IB, the RAW, others. And I think one of the very powerful statements, if I'm not mistaken, this thing that India is one of the only democracies in the world whose intelligence agencies are not accountable to the parliament of the people. And it's important because the national security state then looks at its own civilians as people to target. So often national security is seen, people might disagree with it, and they should, rightly so. Often national security traditionally is seen as a system of agencies that work to protect its citizens from outside forces. Now, the way in which India's national security state has been built, especially post 9/11, given every one of these attacks, is incredible amounts of funds that have gone in. So the India's securitization narrative, the national security state, the series of laws that have now normalized the use of the word terrorist and using counterinsurgency laws against your own civilians, they are also a very key and important actor that directly lead to marginalization, especially when it comes to Muslim communities. I just kind of wanted to quite quickly put it there because, this is quite well known for everybody, but I think it's also something that we have to very consistently think about and flag.
No, absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing that up, Suchitra. In the interest of time, we're going to have to wrap it up here. We are 4 minutes over the hour. So I will conclude here by saying that as we look to the future, as our panelists have mentioned, there is this need to act, there's a need to speak up. And so we urge those of you who are watching to keep up some form of pressure by sharing the information in this briefing, by sharing the report the Association for the Protection of Civil Rights put out, and all the good information in there. Refuse to allow the BJP's narrative to go unchallenged. So we'll wrap it here. This briefing was co-sponsored by Genocide Watch, World Without Genocide, Indian American Muslim Council, Hindus for Human Rights, New York State Council of Churches, CARE, the Polis Project, Hindus for Human Rights, ANZ, the Religious Nationalism Project, American Muslim Institution, the London Story, Association of Indian Muslims of America, INSAF, India Labor Solidarity, and 12 Ummah, as well as the Center for Pluralism. Thank you again to all of our panelists. It was an honor to have you here, and thank you as well to all of our attendees. Stay informed, stay vocal, and we will see you all in future briefings.
Thank you, Safa.
Thank you, and keep fighting for it.